Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. The Appalachian religious landscape includes plenty of Baptist, Methodist, and Holiness churches, as well as Roman Catholic parishes and Jewish communities, a Muslim mosque, and various Asian communities. A lesser-known Protestant church in this part of the South is the United Church of Christ. My guest today, the Reverend Tamara Franks, joins us to talk about this important tradition within progressive Christianity in America. Welcome, Reverend Franks.
Thank you. I'm humbled to be here.
Thank you. May I call you Tamara?
You may, please do.
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and join us. I think it's important because the United Church of Christ is an important denomination in America, but not so well known in this part of the country. So I'm looking forward to learning more about your tradition, and in particular your church here in the High Country.
Good.
Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, just
Sure.
introduce who you are and how you came to be a minister in the UCC in Boone, North Carolina.
It's a journey that began a fur piece back, actually. I'm in my fourth career, and I was raised on the plains of the Texas Panhandle on a corn and cotton farm, and that is still very much a huge piece of my spirit, and my spirituality is a connection to the land and understanding that truly does nourish us and provide for what we need. And within that upbringing, I was raised in the Southern Baptist tradition, which is still rich for me. The biblical tradition of that essence of a faith tradition is really still grounded, very much of who I am, really. And growing up, Southern Baptist, how we grew up, I was at church 3 times a week, right?
Right.
Sunday morning and training union on Sunday nights and Wednesday night prayer meeting. And our youth group was really important and strong in my own upbringing, specifically around choir and music, but then really around missions, because in the Southern Baptist tradition, that understanding of mission is really big. It's changed now for me what mission is. And a piece of that journey has gone through being an outdoor wilderness guide. That was probably my first career when I got out of graduate school. From Texas A&M, I ended up doing the adventuring piece of life.
Right.
And then that was pretty wonderful because then I ended up actually getting to teach at Texas A&M, those next generation of outdoor recreators and outdoor adventurers. And the interesting thing about that is I always understood that there was a connection between our spirituality and our connection with the land. And so if life had been a little bit different, I was really trying to write at the time a thesis, the benefits of spirituality in an outdoor program or in an outdoor adventure. And at the time, I didn't have the circle of people around me to really help me work through how to define spirituality at that time in my life, in my mid-20s.
Yeah, so pretty traditional route to ministry.
Pretty traditional.
Yes, you've got a little bit of Baptist, a little bit of transcendentalism in
Yep.
you, a little bit of everything. That's really interesting that at this point in your life you've come to this career choice.
Right.
Why UCC?
Well, that nudge was still there. I mean, that nudge had always been there. And when I was actually at A&M, a colleague of mine says, I heard you write a Christian curriculum for an outdoor experience. And I said, I did. And so I offered it to them. And on one Sunday when my church was closed because of spring break, I popped over to experiment on what this other congregation might look and sound like, never having heard of the United Church of Christ.
Right.
And lo and behold, I walk into this Friends Congregational Church in College Station, Texas, and there's a woman minister whom I'd never experienced before, and she was good. And the worship that day opened up spaces in me that had not really ever been opened.
Okay.
And that was about 1997, 98, and I've been a piece of the UCC ever since.
Well, a lot of people have never heard of the United Church of Christ, or they think they have, and maybe they equate it to the more familiar Church of Christ, which is an entirely different tradition. Or as you said earlier, equate it with Unitarians. But the United Church of Christ is something entirely different, and it's one of those congregations that comes into the conversation when you talk about progressive Christianity in America. Can you tell me what progressive Christianity means to you?
So for me, it means that we are really listening to the still speaking presence of God. And so for me, and what I would assume within our own United Church of Christ, progressive means that God is still speaking and that we're not serving or worshiping a static God. And so we're continually watching to see where the Spirit is emerging, to see where this new understanding of how we understand our faith to continually emerge. And we're listening for the next understanding and iteration of how to be in relationship with all things.
Right.
And so there's women in leadership. That's a big one within the UCC.
Right, right. And so you mentioned a grounding in biblical tradition, yet an ever-emerging revelation.
Right.
So does that mean that you're open to interpreting Scripture in light of kind of evolving faith, or that you're open to other sources of authority, or both, or
all
neither?
Of the above.
All of the above, okay.
Really all of the above. I mean, if you walk into our church on any given Sunday, you might hear a text from Ezekiel or from the Gospel of Matthew, and at the same time we might read something from Rumi or from Mary Oliver or from Thomas Berry.
Yeah.
And so we watch for where we hear the still speaking God.
And how would your biblical exegesis or interpretation differ from, say, more conservative tradition, for example? How do you view the Bible operating within the world of faith? Or does it differ? Maybe it doesn't.
There's a piece of me that it doesn't. I mean, we're doing the exegesis as how do we read this text? How do we attempt to hear this text as it was written in the first century? Or beyond that, if from the Old Testament and the Hebrew Testament. And we try to listen for that cultural piece. And then how would that cultural piece maybe have been heard here in the 21st century?
Right.
So we really try to hear how it was originally intended, which may be a little bit different than some of my colleagues in a different tradition of theology, and really hear that as it was written in context, the contextual piece of it in the first century Roman Empire world, and how do we hear that in the 21st century American Empire world? And that's tricky.
Tricky business, yeah.
And it's hard and it's complicated.
Right. So the United Church of Christ, I'm a bit of a history geek, so it has a complicated history. I know it is part of the Protestant tradition, and comes out of that tradition. And here in America, it's been part of when we talk about Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, and these were names associated with the movement in the 19th century that moved away from denominationalism and wanted to kind of recreate a generic Christianity, I guess.
Right.
Is that still part of the UCC vision I don't guess it's non-denominational because you are a denomination, but to embrace the word Christian in a more whole sense, I guess?
I think so, definitely. I mean, that understanding of Christianity is we still take the text as something that we're going to utilize, and we're listening for how we understand those teachings of Jesus to really draw us into that relationship of taking care of our neighbor, of loving our neighbor as ourselves. And that word Christian isn't a specific, possibly, creed, although it is in a sense. And really, the creed really is how do we continually listen for where Jesus is teaching of loving your neighbor, of really watching for where the widow and the poor and those marginalized peoples, those oppressed peoples, of how we attempt to offer them life, and how we attempt to draw them into a community.
Yeah, so I looked on your website and looked at the UCC website and talk about mission and goals, I think. Is there a creed that is specifically for UCCs?
There's a statement of faith.
Statement of faith. Okay.
So they've written a statement of faith that on any given Sunday at a UCC church you might show up and you might hear that statement of faith read. And there are some UCC churches, this is how the polity is a little different than some of your other mainline denominations, is you may hear an Apostles' Creed read on a Sunday morning. That's going to be probably some of my more conservative and formal liturgies. And so, Corinth Reformed Church in Hickory, you might hear that. Or First Reformed Church in China, my North Carolina. China Grove, you might hear that, right? Okay. And so when you look into the UCC, the complication is that we come from the German Evangelical and Lutheran piece. We come from the Congregational Christian piece. And here in North Carolina, we come from the Afro-Christian piece.
Right.
And so in any of those churches, their history is really going to determine how they understand that word creed.
So it's not just one. I mean, it sounds like even within UCC tradition, there's a complex of different varieties of United Church of Christ members and congregations.
Completely.
Yeah. So another name that comes up when I talk about UCC in my classes is Charles Grandison Finney, who's usually associated with evangelicalism, but he was second president of Oberlin College, which is historically a UCC or college, and Oberlin has long been associated with kind of progressive policies, and Finney and Oberlin were early advocates for abolition, for co-educational work within the colleges. I think Oberlin was the first college in the country to admit African Americans to higher education. So that's part of your history and tradition that you kind of embrace, right? I mean, that's still part of the worldview of UCC, as I understand it.
The progressive piece really is social justice oriented.
Okay.
And so that's really how the evangelical, or when you start talking about, the Baptist tradition, that's a huge piece of how my faith has changed and emerged differently. And our whole understanding of our call around salvation really is, how do we understand social justice? And so if we have a call to be there for our neighbor and to love our neighbor, that's that progressive piece of, my neighbor are the people who in many traditions are either outcast or pushed aside and not allowed, either for racism or for sexuality or for gender or for female-male exclusion. And so the whole piece of progressivism, that's the wrong word, I apologize, is really how, that's the complicated, messy piece, is how do I truly understand that we are all one?
Right. And that changes by cultural context, right?
Completely.
Yeah. So when you talk about progressive values now, it's different from when Finney was leading Oberlin College. Speaking of higher education, I thought it might be interesting to mention that here in North Carolina, Elon University has UCC connections, as well as Catawba College.
Correct.
And there's even a Barton University named after Barton Stone.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think that's Disciples of Christ, but there's some connection there too. So, the UCCs have been around us all the time. We just didn't know it, right?
Well, the interesting thing is, I mean, if you talk to some UCCers, they want you to know that we were the first, right? The Pilgrims, the Separatists, the Puritists. I mean, that is at the base of Congregationalism.
Right.
And so you had the Congregational Church that actually joined with the Christians.
Yep.
And that was a piece of one of those mainstreams that came into the United Church of Christ.
So you mentioned Congregationalism, which is a description of a kind of ecclesiastical governance. Do you still practice this form of governance within UCC Church today? Does the congregation, for example, make its own decisions about hiring ministers and budgets and missions and whatnot, or do you have a hierarchical arrangement?
So in my congregation, again, it's going to be congregation by congregation, and you're going to see some of that history come up. And so in my German Evangelical and Reformed congregations that are now UCC, you're probably going to see more of a hierarchical piece to their polity, but technically, all churches have what's called an associational congregational polity. And so each church can fire and hire. Each church can buy their own property. Each church is traditionally led as a congregational polity, meaning I'm not in charge. Meaning, even though my congregants, who many of them have come from other traditions where the pastor was in charge, when they say, Tamara, how do you want this done? I say, well, we're a congregation. How would you like this done?
Right.
And so we're still working into that because we're a young congregation and we come from a variety of denominations. But the congregation is in charge. We have a council, we have a moderator, we don't have a president. And so the moderator really is an interesting piece because they're attempting to moderate all the voices. You know, and it's like herding cats
This
sometimes.
gets tricky too, right?
Yes.
Democracy is messy. So.
Yes.
Well, I pulled some pictures off of
Sure.
your website. I want to take a look at it and have you
Great.
comment on them because I think the first thing that sort of stands out to me is that your church, your worship space, is not traditional, but it is very intentional in some of the ways you present yourself to the world. So maybe you can just comment here on this first picture of the exterior of your worship space. It's a beautiful display here.
Can I tell a funny story about these doors?
You may absolutely tell any story you want about these. So we have doors here that have been painted.
They are. So they are the colors of the rainbow. And if you go to godsdoors.org, this actually started from a different UCC church up in the north, and they were attempting to say, how do we make the people or allow all the people to know that we really do want everybody in here? So offering an extravagant welcome is a huge concept across the UCC. So we believe that our call is to offer an extravagant welcome to whoever comes in these doors. Right. Whether they believe like we do, whether they look like we do, and it can be tricky again. Yeah. And so our church, we came in as an open and affirming congregation. Within the UCC, you can take on different designations. So 20 years ago, when this congregation first came into being, it came in as an open and affirming congregation, meaning specific to sexuality, gender, ability, mental state. We want you to know that you can be in leadership here. You can serve in any capacity that you feel called to serve in. Right. And so oftentimes we see these rainbow doors and we automatically assume that they're around LGBTQ acceptance, and it is, and it's more than that for us. Right. And here in Watauga County, we've been wanting to put out a rainbow flag. And we are out in the middle of Watauga County, out in the rural county, where we're surrounded by a lot of Confederate flags. And so there's a piece of us that says, well, if we're truly welcoming, is that then somehow excluding our neighbors? If we put out a rainbow flag and someone steals it, well, then we've just, is that really what we want to do? And so we've had this conversation back and forth, and we wanted to play with these doors and use these doors, and so we were trying to figure out where to install them. And they were going to go out back, and then they were going to go out on the back lawn, and they ended up on our front lawn. And I thought, isn't this funny? So we were a little bit afraid of putting out a flag, and here we have these permanent doors that say great. God's doors are open to all. Yeah, and that's what, in case you can't see on the television, God's doors are open to all. And that's really a core value for us in a belief. Yeah, I went and I tried to pull down some of what I thought might be your core values and wanted you to comment on them. And since we're looking at this, the very first one that came to my mind was this principle of acceptance of all people. And you tie it theologically, I think, to the notion that human beings are created in the image of God. Is that kind of the core part of this value, that if all people are a reflection of the divine spirit, then how do we as human beings exclude anyone? Right, and it also comes out of John, I think John 17:21, where Jesus said, may they all be one. And so really, how do we understand that we are all one body? And so when Jesus said that we are all one body, how do we truly live into that? And if God created all things, and we believe that there was a holy creator that created all things sacred, then that really truly does all things are sacred, including creation. Yeah. And I want to come back to the point about creation in a moment, but maybe we can look at a couple of more pictures here. Here's a interior of your worship space. It's, again, if you're expecting stained glass and pipe organs, you're in the wrong place here. But it's beautiful nonetheless, and maybe we can go to the next picture, which has a little more detail on the interior of your space. This is the altar, the pulpit, and it looks like a place for an orchestral ensemble. But I wanted to point out one thing and then let you comment on what we're seeing here. On the pulpit is a symbol. It's a comma. It's a red comma. It's a red comma, and that's your church's logo, and you might want to maybe talk about that a little bit. That's the United Church of Christ's logo that came out to about 25 years ago now, actually. And so based on the Gracie Allen quote that said, "Do not place a period where God has placed a comma, God is still speaking." So that truly is our belief that we are continually listening for the voice of God, through contemplation and meditation and prayer and discernment. Where is this voice continuing to call us into our next days, our next years, our next generations?
Yeah. So that's reflective then of this kind of unfolding, continuing revelation of God in the world.
Right. And so this is the womb, and again you see the comma. So it's again this, what are we birthing? What is continuing to emerge? And so in today's world you hear a lot about emergence theory.
Yeah.
And so for us that is the comma. And so what are we watching emerge? And where is our next call for justice?
And you have this kind of symbolism spread out throughout your worship space.
We
is that
do.
right? Yeah. So let's see what else we have here in terms of photographs. I think this is outside a beautiful memorial garden.
This is brand new this summer. This is the Bill and Peggy Rogers Meditation Corner that is housed within our meditation or memorial garden. And so now what you don't see is there's 2 benches on this area. And we do believe that, to sit with God, to sit in silence and to listen, to attempt to let all the cares and the stresses of the world go away, and to truly be in connection with all living things. And that for us is the voice of God, where we hear that next revelation.
Well, you've mentioned a couple of times this connection with the natural world.
Right.
And you've mentioned, I think, a kind of theological responsibility for care of creation. So that's another value here, right? The idea of creation care and responsible care of the environment. Could you mention that a little bit? Is that a particular, I could see where that would be a particular emphasis of your congregation being located here in the mountains, but this is also a more general UCC emphasis. Is that correct?
We use the term environmental justice. And so for us, how are we in relationship with the environment? In some places here in North Carolina, we have the Creation Care Alliance. And so you're going to see it named in different places in different associations or conferences. For us specifically here, actually before I got here, this church, through the congregation, congregational led, actually has passed a chemical-free campus. So we're not completely chemical-free, but we try really hard to actually even notice what are we cleaning with, to try not to use pesticides or herbicides, but to try to understand that to be in relationship, it matters the air we breathe. The air is doing everything it can to help us be healthy, but if we're the ones putting carbon dioxide in it or pollutants in it, that's on us.
Right. Yeah, it's very difficult to be chemical-free in today's world.
It's hard.
Yeah. You've also mentioned a couple of times in various segments the value of social justice and ministry to marginalized people in the world. Is that a kind of local emphasis? Does ministering to social justice issues differ in Boone than, say, it would in Charlotte, North Carolina? And what does that look like in Boone?
In Boone, for us specifically, it really depends on who the congregation is, and what are their callings and what are they led to do. And in our world, at the High Country UCC, we like to feed people. Yeah. We love to feed people, and so you're going to see us. A farm cafe actually came out of a campfire, and a woman said to Renee Bowman, I think you might get into this thing called a community cafe. And 3 years after that conversation, Farm Cafe opened its doors on King Street. And then I think the other piece of that is it's really important for us not to just hold it and say, hey, we did that.
Right.
But it came out of that. And so our justice and our call to ministry is to know that there's something bigger than us, and it's continually about the community. And so for this church, we like to feed people, so you're going to see us involved in Western Watauga food outreach. You're going to see us involved in gathering food for the Health and Hunger Coalition or for another entity that needs food.
Well, food insecurity is a problem in this area.
Exactly.
I know we're blessed on this campus, and in Boone it's a very well-to-do area, but we sometimes don't see what's all around us. So I think that's a great example of how your church is reaching out to the community. And I read somewhere that you found yourself in a kind of ticklish budgetary situation where you ended a couple of years in the black and you had more money than you knew what to do with. So you gave it to some community organizations.
We did.
Yeah. So that was another example of this kind of outreach emphasis.
And again, that was congregational led, and so we put up 15 different places to give some money, and then our congregation decided on the top 6 based on just dots. So that's all congregational led.
So I had Renee Mobin on as a guest a couple of weeks ago on this show, and we talked about the Farm Cafe. So
I hope she talked about Duke's mayonnaise.
I don't think she mentioned Duke's mayonnaise. Is this a staple at the Farm Cafe?
It is. It is.
Not Hellman's.
Don't even think about offering Renee
So
Bowman Hellman's mayonnaise.
We're in the South, so we have to go with Duke's.
Duke's.
Just for those of you who may not know, the Farm Cafe is a pay-what-you-can organization so that all people can eat. It's a wonderful part of our community. And, thank you to your congregation for being so instrumental in getting that started.
That was before my time, actually.
Well, it's okay. That's right.
It's okay.
It still speaks highly of the community. I read an article that I think was written by your minister of youth, in which she says that UCC congregations tend to ask difficult questions and embrace mystery, and this sometimes is controversial. Is this something you see as a value, being free to ask difficult questions and embrace mystery? Because a lot of times when I think about religious organizations, they want certainty, right? And sometimes asking difficult questions undercuts certainty. So this seems like a different approach to the questions of life.
It goes back to an extravagant welcome. And so one of the biggest questions that you ask, okay, if we're going to offer an extravagant welcome, does that mean that if we have a known sex offender, are we going to allow them to come worship with us? If someone walks in that we know have completely opposing political values to us, are we going to worship with them and accept them into the loving arms of this community and attempt to listen, right? And to not listen to change their mind, but to listen as if they are a piece of us and we truly are all one. Currently, in 2020, we passed a commitment to become a wise church, welcoming, inclusive, supportive, and engaging for anyone on the health spectrum, the mental health spectrum. You know, and so if we have someone that comes into our congregation to worship and they have a bipolar disorder, or they have a disorder that causes them to interrupt our worship time, right? Our call is to how do we understand the mystery of that, and as uncomfortable as that may be, our call is to listen into that, is to lean into that and understand and to look for the sacred and the holy in that moment.
Well, that's a great note to end on, I think. And I want to thank you for, again, coming to talk to us today and helping us better understand the United Church of Christ. And you're in Vilas, you have a website, so if people are interested in connecting, they can do that via the High Country United Church of Christ. HighCountryUnitedChurchofChrist.org, or High Country UCC. UCC is kind of what everybody calls it. Great. Well, thank you again, Tamara. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life this week. I hope you join us next week here again on App TV, and we'll be taking a look at some sacred photography and photography of churches in the area as we continue to explore the relationship of religion and culture. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.